Seltzer Kings.
Podcasts.
This episode is brought to you by Greenlight. Get this. Adults with financial literacy skills have 82% more wealth than those who don't. From swimming lessons to piano classes, us parents invest in so many things to enrich our kids' lives. But are we investing in their future financial success? With Greenlight, you can teach your kids financial literacy skills like earning, saving, and investing. And this investment costs less than that after-school treat. Start prioritizing their financial education and future today with a risk-free trial at greenlight.com/Spotify. Greenlight.com/Spotify.
Ryan Reynolds here from Mint Mobile. I don't know if you knew this, but anyone can get the same premium wireless for $15 a month plan that I've been enjoying. It's not just for celebrities. So do like I did and have one of your assistants switch you to Mint Mobile today. I'm told it's super easy to do at mintmobile.com/switch.
Upfront payment of $45 for 3-month plan, equivalent to $15 per month required. Intro rate first 3 months only, then full price plan options available. Taxes and fees extra. See full terms at mintmobile.com.
Oh, please, Gavin, these days MI6 couldn't smuggle biscuits into a tea shop. Ass. The following podcast contains...
Only I didn't say fudge.
And for gosh sake, watch your language.
Watch your profanity.
Right, I'm sorry.
explicit language. Hello and welcome to the podcast that asks a simple question. When you decided to finance your illegal arms deals with even more illegal drug deals, what the hell were you thinking? I'm your host, Dave Bledsoe, and this is episode number 493, Secret Dealer Man edition of the show, and it's part 3 and the conclusion of the crack epidemic. We think. We hope. Stay tuned. The What the Hell Were You Thinking podcast is brought to you by the Central Intelligence Agency. We want you to know we're less evil than you think we are, but more evil than you'd like us to be. The CIA performs a vital mission in keeping our nation safe from hostile foreign powers, be they peer or near-peer states, terrorist organizations, or even narcotics traffickers. We at the CIA understand you think we're some sort of super sinister spy agency, but really, we're just people doing a job. The days when we fomented coups, plotted assassinations, and financed proxy wars are long gone, but we'd be lying if we said we didn't miss them. So when you think about the CIA, don't think about the terrible things we did in the past. Think about all the great things that we're doing right now that we can't tell you about, because if we did, we'd have to kill you.
A ton of cocaine, pure cocaine worth hundreds of millions, is smuggled into the United States. Sound familiar? Not the way this ton of cocaine got here. According to what the former head of the Drug Enforcement Administration told Mike Wallace, this drug shipment got here courtesy of what he calls drug trafficking by the CIA in partnership with the Venezuelan National Guard.
And what reason did the CIA have for promoting this drug smuggling?
Well, the only rationale that's ever been offered is that this would lead to some valuable drug intelligence about the Colombian cartels.
The CIA and the Guardia Nacional wanted to let cocaine go on into the traffic without doing anything. They wanted to let it come up to the United States, no surveillance, no nothing.
In other words, you weren't going to stop them in Miami or Houston or wherever. These drugs were simply going to go to the United States and then go into the traffic and eventually reach the streets.
That's what they wanted to do, yes.
Back in my military days, I did my time on the front line of the drug wars.
Thank you.
Service paid, service rendered, I guess.
I spent a delightful 3 months in Honduras, where I participated in the mission-critical task of,
You got drunk?
Big time. They sent me and my bomb-sniffing dog down to Honduras in case the cartels tried to, I don't know, smuggle a bomb in some army guy's duffel bag.
So that doesn't seem like
a thing that would happen? Yeah, it wasn't. And what's worse, the actual drug dogs that were supposed to be doing the real mission of stopping the aforementioned army guys from loading up their duffels with weed and coke before they went back stateside, yeah, they left and I was alone down there for a month where me and the dog pretended to look for drugs.
Military intelligence.
Then there were my 3 months working with United States Customs on the Texas border.
I am the one on the front lines.
I mean, not really, because legally I had no power to search, seize, or arrest, so I was basically accomplishing as much as I did with Honduras, looking for drug dogs with a dog that sniffed for explosives.
Not everyone who looks like a hero is a hero.
I did interdict one shipment of drugs from crossing the border into the United States.
Did you know?
Absolutely. You see, what had happened was that I'd hooked up with this stripper. I'd met her over on the El Paso side of the border, and it seemed like she was really into me.
We used you for sex and moved on.
No, she didn't use me for sex. I mean, come on. Can you imagine anyone using me for sex?
Fair point.
No, once she found out that I was working with customs, she had a different plan, and I wouldn't learn about that plan until the last minute. See, after we hooked up a couple of times, she suggested that we should go over to Juarez, Mexico for an evening of light debauchery, a plan I enthusiastically agreed with. And as we drank ridiculously cheap beer in a Juarez dive bar, my friend excused herself from the table and was gone for at least 20 minutes. I'd like to say that I was worried about her, but by this time, I was pretty drunk.
Naturally.
When she came back, she informed me that we needed to leave right now. And I asked why, because it seemed like a reasonable question. That's when she told me that she had placed a fairly significant amount of an illicit substance in her hoo-ha and needed my help to get her past customs and back into the States. And if I did this, she said, she would make it worth my while. Now look, pod friends, the sex was good, but not good enough to go to jail for, so I wasn't going to do it. But also, I didn't want her to know that I wasn't going to do it. So I told her, sure, I'd need her right out front of the bar. I just needed to duck in the bathroom and take a piss. And when I went to go to the bathroom, I ran out the back of the bar and disappeared, running all the way to the border, and never saw her again. Because it's no sex, not even hot stripper sex, is worth going to jail. And honestly, I am not cut out for the smuggler life, unlike, say, the Central Intelligence Agency. Which brings me to this week's topic, and finally, the conclusion of the topic. What did the CIA have to do with the crack epidemic? Was it a plot by the CIA and the Reagan administration to destroy black people in America? It's a hefty topic, but we're going to finish it in one episode, I promise. Before we begin, we got to talk about
This shit again?
the backstory of the Central Intelligence Agency, because we should know the bad guy in this story. You see, for most of the history of this country, we had no spy agencies. I mean, we had spies going all the way back to the Revolutionary War, but they were always like ad hoc free agents.
Amateurs.
Benedict Arnold was one of our very first spies before he became our first turncoat double agent. Then there was the extensive spying during the Civil War, but again, this was largely done by enthusiastic volunteers rather than a formal clandestine service. During World War I, the military recruited and fielded spies before and during the war, but it was World War II that really kickstarted professional espionage in this country. You see, prior to Pearl Harbor, the various branches of the military and the FBI had spies in their operations, but the agencies did not coordinate or share the information those spies obtained.
Just like now.
Frustrated by this, Franklin Delano Roosevelt created the Office of Coordinator of Information, or COI, headed by a dude named General William Wild Bill Donovan. Donovan is one of those historical figures that seems like he should be written entirely for a B-grade movie, but was in fact a real person. He was a World War I hero, but he also was a lawyer, diplomat, and a born spook. He created the Office of Strategic Services, modeled on the British MI6, their foreign intelligence agency, and began creating a vast intelligence network in Europe and Asia. The OSS did all kinds of wild shit, and not always successfully.
Idiots! You weren't supposed to kill her!
And he recruited some names that would go on to feature prominently in the OSS's successor organization and American history, for better, but usually for worse. After the war, the OSS was dissolved and folded into a series of organizations that involved intelligence gathering but were not clearly defined. This is because starting in 1945, as soon as the war was over, plans were being drawn up to create something bigger, something better, something bolder than the OSS, a keystone in what would become the military-industrial complex. From the CIA itself, with their own personal history, quote, "The National Security Act of 1947 established the CIA as an independent civilian intelligence agency within the executive branch. The act charged the CIA with coordinating the nation's intelligence activities and, among other duties, collecting, evaluating, and disseminating intelligence affecting national security. The act also created the Director of Central Intelligence, or DCI, to lead both the CIA and the U.S. intelligence community. The DCI also served as the president's main advisor on all intelligence matters. President Truman appointed Roscoe Hillenkotter to be the first to lead the new agency. 1/3 of the CIA's personnel were OSS veterans," unquote. And while Wild Bill Donovan was not in charge of this new agency, after a string of generals briefly held the post, one of his main proteges would be tapped to lead it, one Allen Dulles, a man whose penchant for drama and questionable ethics make Wild Bill seem like Meek William by comparison. Dulles had one simple ethos.
Take that, you fucking commie!
No matter the cost. Dulles would lead the CIA for over a decade and do some of the shadiest shit imaginable in the name of fighting communism, instilling in the agency a sense that it's not illegal or immoral if you're doing it to save the world from communism. Which is why the CIA was accused of, and, well, probably did at least some of the wild shit we're getting ready to talk about. When we started this series back in what feels like 1983, we talked about how the CIA at least tacitly approved of coke smuggling to fund its counter-Castro operations in the 60s and early 70s.
You bring me rumors and conjecture.
It wasn't that the CIA was actively profiting or even permitting anything. They were just not asking questions, so no one had to tell them any lies. And this was working well for everyone involved. As former CIA Director William Colby told a Senate committee in 1988, as quoted from a PBS Frontline story, quote, "The CIA has a solid rule against being involved in drug trafficking. That's not to say that some of the people who the CIA has used or been in touch with over the years may well have themselves been involved in drug trafficking, but not the CIA," unquote.
See the difference?
One of those people the CIA had been in contact with was the de facto military dictator of the Republic of General Manuel Noriega. The full story of old Pineapple Face,
now that's just hurtful,
is an episode in and of itself and will be told as part of our upcoming summer series this year. But the
Okay, here we go. The short version.
Noriega had been working with and for the CIA going back as far as the mid-1950s, and he provided them with intel about so-called socialist groups in Panama. He entered the Panamanian military and attended the infamous School of the Americas, which is and was a CIA training camp for aspiring Central and South American military dictators. Noriega became the head of the intelligence for the pro-U.S. government in Panama that came to power in a coup in 1968, and by the mid-1970s, the U.S. government already had evidence that Manny was dabbling in drug trafficking. This did not stop the CIA from using him for their own purposes and protected him from being investigated by other U.S. agencies. Noriega was getting paid as much as $100,000 a year by the CIA to do some odd jobs for them.
We got running guns, kidnapping, murder.
And at the same time, Manny was balls deep in the drug trade and was not being particularly subtle about it. As Reuters put it in an obit for Noriega, quote, U.S. officials knew about some of his criminal deals as early as 1978, according to testimony, and by 1983 had a 21-cannon barrage of evidence against Noriega. But the United States first refrained from taking action, partly because Panama was seen as a buffer state against leftist insurgencies in Central America during the Cold War, unquote. And as any student of the time knows, the boogeyman of Central American leftists in the 80s were the Sandinistas in Nicaragua. Noriega was hand in glove with the CIA in their efforts to oust the Sandinistas by supporting their enemies in the conflict, the Contras. Only in the 1980s would be a video game depicting a CIA covert war replete with all sorts of blatant and hideous war crimes. The full stories of the Contras is yet another episode that is coming up very shortly. But
in a nutshell,
much of the funding for the Contra war against the Sandinistas was financed via the sale of cocaine along with illegal arms sales to Iran. How much of those sales were facilitated by Noriega remains unclear, probably because the documents dealing with that information were shredded by Fawn Hall during one of her midnight shredder parties, but you could safely assume, given the spiderweb of connections, that at least some of the drugs and money were funneled through Noriega and Panama. At least until the whole thing came out, it almost brought down the Reagan presidency, and did bring down Manuel Noriega when George Herbert Walker Bush invaded Panama in 1989 to oust him from power. But it's the Contra connection that becomes germane to our story this week, because you see, there's a theory.
I've got a theory, we should work this out.
That through the Contras, crack cocaine was poured into black neighborhoods in an intentional effort to destroy them. In 1995, a reporter for the San Jose Mercury News was chasing a story. Gary Webb was a veteran investigative journalist, and his stories had uncovered corporate crime and political corruption at the state and local level. The Mercury News recruited him in 1988, and his reporting contributed to the paper winning a Pulitzer in 1990.
He's legit.
So it was when he came to his editors with a huge story that could be the biggest thing to rock the country since Watergate, they told him,
Hells yeah, let's do it.
The lead of that story was published in August of 1996 in the San Jose Mercury News, and it was pretty fucking dramatic. Quote, for the better part of a decade, a San Francisco Bay Area drug ring sold tons of cocaine to Crips and Bloods street gangs of Los Angeles and funneled millions of dollars in drug profits to a Latin American guerrilla army run by the U.S. Central Intelligence Agency, a Mercury News investigation has found. This drug network opened the first pipeline between Colombia's cocaine cartels and the black neighborhoods of Los Angeles, a city now known as the crack capital of the world. The cocaine that flooded in helped spark a crack explosion in urban America and provided the cash and connections needed for LA gangs to buy automatic weapons, and is one of the most bizarre alliances in modern history. The union of a U.S.-backed army attempting to overthrow a revolutionary socialist government and the Uzi-toting gangstas of Compton and South Central Los Angeles. The Army's financiers, who met with CIA agents both before and during the time they were selling drugs in L.A., delivered cut-rate cocaine to the gangs through a young South Central crack dealer named Ricky Donald Ross. Unaware of his supplier's military and political connections, Freeway Rick, a dope dealer of mythic proportions in the LA drug world, turned the cocaine powder into crack and wholesaled it to gangs across the country. The cash Ross paid for the cocaine, court records show, was then used to buy weapons and equipment for a guerrilla army named the Fuerza Democrática Nicaragüense, or the Nicaragua Democratic Force, or FDN, the largest of several anti-communist groups commonly called the Contras, unquote. The story went on to detail how three men, Ricky Ross, an American drug dealer, and Oscar Danielo Blandon and Norwin Menendez, two Nicaraguan smugglers, imported huge amounts of cocaine into the U.S. in the early 80s. The men were well known to law enforcement, but no action was taken against them at any of the time, and Menendez had close contact with a known CIA operative working in Nicaragua. Low-cost cocaine was smuggled into L.A. and protected by the CIA and sold to be turned into crack cocaine, and the proceeds of the sales of that coke were sent back to the Contras by the CIA to purchase weapons.
That sounds bad.
The story was hardly implausible, since a Senate committee had found the CIA doing pretty much exactly this back in 1988. The Kerry Commission, helmed by Senator John Kerry, found that, as per Wikipedia, quote, there was a substantial evidence of drug smuggling on the part of individual Contras, Contra suppliers, Contra pilots, mercenaries who worked with the Contras, and Contra supporters. It did not find that Contra leaders were personally involved in drug trafficking. The Kerry Committee report found that the Contra drug links included payments to drug traffickers through the U.S. State Department funds, authorized by Congress for humanitarian assistance to the Contras, and in some cases after the traffickers had been indicted by federal law enforcement agencies on drug charges, unquote. So, you can see how people might be receptive to the idea that Webb was offering. Webb's story was the first time a direct link from the Contra's CIA-supported side hustle had been connected to drug markets in the United States, and going further, directly to the explosion in the sale and consumption of crack cocaine in one of the flashpoints of the crack epidemic, which had been burning through the nation's cities for a decade. This revelation, as you might imagine, upset some people.
Master of understatement, as usual.
The official backlash from Democratic politicians was fairly predictable, but the unofficial reaction was a bit more phlegmatic. From a New York Times article written in the weeks following the revelation, quote, black intellectuals said that African Americans were quicker than whites to believe in the possibility of CIA involvement in the spread of crack. It was largely the product of a bitter history. A telephone poll conducted for the New York Times and WCBS TV found that a quarter of the 1,047 black New Yorkers surveyed believe that the government deliberately makes sure that drugs are easily available in poor black neighborhoods in order to harm black people. And another third of those polls said that it might possibly be true. Similarly, the polls showed that blacks were more likely than whites to believe that the AIDS virus was created to infect black people and that the government persecutes black elected officials. This plays into long-standing feelings that blacks have that the government is up to no good with regard to them. Alvin F. Poussaint, a clinical professor of psychiatry at the Harvard University Medical School, said of the Mercury News reports, I think this would have caught on even if you didn't have an internet, Dr. Poussaint said. The suspicions were also fed by contemporary evidence. Among other recent events, he cited the CIA's involvement with General Manuel Antonio Noriega, the former Panamanian dictator, the revelations of the Iran-Contra scandal, and the frequent disparities in sentencing between whites who deal in powdered cocaine and blacks who sell crack. suffering from syphilis went untreated, secret campaigns in the 60s and early 70s by the FBI that sought to spy on discredit Black Panther movement and Dr. Martin Luther King Jr. and other black leaders, the FBI sting operation that captured Marion Barry, Washington, D.C., smoking crack in a hotel room, unquote. The only thing that came quicker than other media outlets picking holes in Webb's story was the howl of denial that came from the U.S. government in general and the CIA specifically. But the black community quite simply had every reason to believe that it was true. After all, this was the same government that had turned a blind eye to Jim Crow, lynching, race massacres, and used black men as unknowing test subjects in medical experience. And not to mention, that whole 3/5 of a person slavery thing. So by the time the article was published, the crack epidemic was waning, but the damage was long done. A generation of young black men were either dead, handicapped, or much more likely in prison for far longer and in far greater numbers than young white men who committed the exact same fucking crime. Black families, the pillar that had held up the black community through the struggle of the civil rights movement, were shattered. Divorce rates skyrocketed, absentee parents, either due to prison or simply abandonment, was endemic, and the economic impact of the commercial flight from the crack zones had left inner cities blighted, empty, and hopeless, while the rest of the country was going through the largest peacetime economic boom in American history. So you can see why black people might just be a little bit pissed off.
I'm still fucking furious about it.
A Columbia Journalism Review article in 1997 picks it up. Quote, "The wildfire-like sweep of Dark Alliance," which was the title of the piece from Webb, "was all the more remarkable because it took place without the tender of the mainstream press. Instead, the story roared through the new communications media of the internet." That's an angle I haven't even addressed. This story was essentially the first huge internet news story, and black talk radio, and two distinct, but in this case somewhat symbiotic information channels. Black-oriented radio talk shows boosted this phenomenon by giving out the website address, and at the same time, the call-in programs themselves became a focal point of information and debate. African-American talk show hosts used their programs to address the allegation of CIA complicity in the crack epidemic, and a public response was forceful. A common charge emerged on black talk radio programs. The U.S. government had conspired to use the crack trade to deliberately harm the African-American community. CIA now meant crack in America, or as Representative Cynthia McKinney stated on the floor of Congress, central intoxication agencies. Thousands of copies of Dark Alliance were handed out at town meetings across the country, playing into the deepest fears and sometimes plunging into paranoia, unquote. Because, pod friends, it was, in fact, paranoia, because the story itself was not so much,
Problem is, it's not exactly true.
In the weeks that followed, the Washington Post, the New York Times, and most in-depth, the Los Angeles Times began to investigate the claims in Dark Alliances. And yes, they found tangential connections to the CIAs and the Contras, most already known because of the Senate investigation, but the bullet of Webb's story, that the cocaine came directly into Los Angeles for the purposes of being made into crack cocaine, it just didn't hold up. From the LA Times investigation, quote, "The crack epidemic in Los Angeles followed no blueprint or master plan. It was not orchestrated by the Contras or the CIA or any single drug ring. No one trafficker, even the kingpins who sold thousands of kilos and pocketed millions of dollars, ever came close to monopolizing the trade. Instead, a Times investigation has found that the explosion of cheap, smokable cocaine in the 1980s was a uniquely egalitarian phenomenon, that one lent itself to a more makeshift mom-and-pop operations than the sinister hand of a government-sanctioned plot. Anyone, even a literate high school dropout, could learn to cook crack on a kitchen stove, hawk it on a street corner, and be $100 richer, all in the same day," unquote. And the man who gave the story to Webb in the first place was not exactly what anyone could call an unimpeachable source. More from the LA Times article, quote, "Today, as Ricky Donald Ross awaits sentences on cocaine conspiracy charges, he paints himself as a victim, created and betrayed by Blandon, who himself was convicted of cocaine trafficking in 1992, and then helped the government snare his old customer in a sting. For Ross, it's more than self-pity. If he can prove that the CIA or the Contras behaved more egregiously than he might be able to convince a U.S. District Court judge to spare him from a life in jail," unquote. Now, the Mercury News stood by their story for months, but in the end, they partially retracted it, citing what they called editorial failures. Wikipedia sums up their reasons. Quote, 1, It presented only one interpretation of conflicting evidence, and in one case did not include information that contradicted a central assertion of the series. 2. The series estimates the money was involved was presented as fact instead of an estimate. And 3. The series oversimplified how the crack epidemic grew. And 4. The series created impressions that were open to misinterpretation through imprecise language and graphics, unquote. This was published over the objections of Webb, who stood by his reporting for years, but in later years he said of the story, quote, he never believed and never wrote that there was a grand CIA conspiracy behind the crack plague. The CIA couldn't even mine a harbor without getting his trench coat stuck in his fly, unquote. Except for one small problem, Gary. You did say that. It was right there in the 3 articles you wrote for the Mercury News. So, yeah, I know the CIA is actually kind of stupid, but maybe you could have thought of that before you wrote the articles. Webb sadly died by suicide in 2004, and if you don't think there were rumors that it was connected, you really don't understand conspiracy theories at all. But no, he was an old man who had lost a bunch of jobs and didn't know where to find himself, and his family had left him, and he just shot himself in the head in a garage. It's sad, but it really had nothing to do with dark alliances. It would be easy to say that, of course, the mainstream media, the white media, would back the CIA in denying their involvement in the crack epidemic, and many black people do this even today. However, the evidence that the crack epidemic was anything other than just,
It's just one of those freaky, unfortunate things that happens.
Just doesn't add up. Yeah, I know that's pretty fucking flip of me to use a drop like that to sum up such a horrible thing, but also, when I use a drop like that, it's just
one of those freaky, unfortunate things that happens.
Some would say that as soon as the coke trade took off in this country, its inevitable result was the crack epidemic. There was too much money and too much coke churning through the American market. The high-end powder market was already saturated by the late 1970s, and frankly, everyone who was going to do coke by that time was doing coke. The product needed to come down in price and to expand its market base if it wished to maintain its growth. Kind of like how Silicon Valley keeps looking for new shit to tell you that you can't live without. Cocaine needed to drop its price point to attract customers that simply couldn't afford powder, and when the recipe for crack, a recipe so easy you could do it in your kitchen, got out from wherever it originated, a whole new market and distribution system was born, but it was a market and distribution system that kept the original supply chain intact with the cartels at the top and expanded to bottom-level dealers. This is capitalism 101. Honestly, if you had written the entire thing up as a business model for your MBA, you would receive high honors except for the part where, coke is illegal. It wasn't the CIA or the U.S. government that made the crack epidemic happen. It was America doing what America does, the fundamental process of free enterprise. Capitalism made the crack epidemic happen. Capitalism killed all those people, and capitalism broke the black communities. But hey, like the show always says, don't be mad at capitalism. Capitalism loves you. And if it doesn't love you, it definitely loves your fucking money.
This episode is brought to you by MeUndies. Underwear drawers are like the Wild West. You never know what you're going to pull out or what shape it's in. So upgrade your collection with the buttery soft comfort of MeUndies. MeUndies' signature fabric is as soft as a warm hug from your favorite sweater. Plus, it's breathable and oh so comfy, making it ideal for all-day wear. Get 20% off your first order, plus free shipping at MeUndies.com/Spotify with code SPOTIFY. That's MeUndies.com/Spotify, code SPOTIFY.
So, you just started using LinkedIn Premium. Now what? Well, on your premium company page, you noticed around 7.5 times more page engagement and 5 times more page views. Well done. And now, new clients are messaging you. All because you're using LinkedIn Premium, which helps you get the business growth you want. Think big, small business. Think big. Start your free trial at linkedin.com/premium small business. That's linkedin.com/premium small business.
That is it for the show this weekend for this goddamn series. And I've been researching, writing, and podcasting about cocaine for 6 fucking weeks, and I gotta tell you, Picked up a pretty nasty cocaine addiction doing so. Figured if I'm going to write about it, I should at least try and see what all the fuss is about. And pod friends, I got to tell you,
God, I love cocaine.
I have never been more in tune with my creative process, and frankly, I've lost like 20 pounds. Cocaine gets a thumbs up from me.
Dave? Dave?
I'm kidding. I haven't done cocaine because...
Booger sugar is for people who can afford it. That's an expensive habit. I come from the kind of family where I'm going to have to immediately transition to crack. I can't be out here... Am I sure that I don't want to bump? Absolutely. That's going to incur a huge lifestyle change for me.
I still haven't done cocaine. I told you at the beginning of this series, it's not that kind of drug. Speaking of finding the right drug, rate and review us so folks can take a listen and figure out that Dave might be the right kind of drug for them. Kick us $1 at patreon.com/whatthehellpodcast because it helps keep the Dave flowing into the country. Do all the things Jeremy tells you to do in the closing credits, otherwise he will have to step on Dave twice as hard to keep the profits up on Dave. And so for me, Dave, I'm a man who lives the life of Danger Bledsoe. Producer,
with all the drinks he takes, he probably won't live to see tomorrow.
Gavin, and all the fictional spooks selling drugs on this show, we want to say, beware of pretty faces that you find. A pretty face can't have an evil mind. That is why you should never, ever help a stripper smuggle drugs across the border from Juarez to El Paso. And we'll see you all next week.
What the Hell Were You Thinking stars Dave Bledsoe and features Gavin St. James and several fictional minions. The show is produced by Kimberly Steele and a part of the Seltzer Kings podcast network. You can find more information on the show on their website, whatthehellpodcast.com, or on Facebook as What the Hell Podcast. Thanks for listening.
I have no ending for this, so I take a small bow.
Initials I and C? Iran-Contra?
Seltzer Kings
Podcasts.